Sustainless can be an alternative way of enjoying and playing the game, and in this video, I want to elaborate more on how people actually play Sustainless. In my other video, I covered the advantages and disadvantages on Sustainless and addressed some misconceptions that come along with it. So for this video, I'll use my own personal experience to explain how I go about the Sustainless process. I also felt like I didn't really convey some of my ideas well enough in the last videos, so I hope to address that here. I understand not everyone is a whale that can afford constant E2 or E6, yet I still use the stainless even for my E0 characters, so I want to mainly focus on my characters that are lower investments that would be more relatable and realistic for the average player. I'll go over on how I exactly do Sustainless in endgame. I won't really cover anomaly arbitration since that game mode is generally too brutal to afford using Sustainless for the average player. I know some people think that there's no need to go Sustainless because sometimes it is overkill, which is sometimes true, but this might sound surprising. I sometimes find using Sustain more frustrating. My damage tanks and rotations are tighter, need to be more precise to fully clear stages. This was how I felt when I first cleared Pure Fiction when I was still a noob. I was barely getting 40,000. Now I'm zero cycling, it feels less stressful because I have so much more AV to spare. I find it quite stressful when I'm barely clearing compared to clearing with a lot more room to spare. Of course, this is just my personal experience. Using a sustain can be a lot more comfortable, especially if it is Memory of Chaos where damage checks are much more brutal. I also want to say just because your characters die doesn't mean it isn't worth it. Memory of Chaos is the only game mode where your characters must stay alive, but in Pure Fiction APOC, you can still have characters die, and that could be considered clear. So let's say you get a 33k score with Sustainless and fail to full clear, but you can only get 26k with the Sustain max. Like, that's your peak performance. It's still technically worth it to go Sustainless if it makes or break your clear. Though your characters may have died, you got a higher overall score. Anyways, let's get started and use an example from Pure Fiction first, because I recently just did a semi-relatable Sustainless clear. I want to go over the process and explain the main points on how exactly Sustainless. I won't really talk about how I split teams since I think that can be a different video explaining how I tackle winning games in general. I want to talk about Anaxa first since he's not very good for Pure Fiction. In fact, he's pretty bad actually. For Herta and Himiko Nova, I can pretty much just troll and still get 40k on them both, but Anaxa has to be Sustainless to score max points. My Anaxa is E0S1 with an E0S0 siren and E0S0 Cerridra, relatively low investment that most F2B players could realistically reach. I already know my team cannot zero cycle at all. I really don't care about optimizing for that in this case. So before I attempted this Pure Fiction, I actually talked with another Anaxa main, discussing whether it's even possible for him to score max points, because, well, he's not very good in this mode. And turns out he was able to get full points against Japard using E0 Siren, so I know it was possible for me. Unfortunately for him, he later realized he wasn't using ER or rope, so he accidentally nerfed himself for no reason. His clear is linked in the description for anyone who's curious. I haven't uploaded my own clear yet, so if you're an Anaxa main that's curious about it, you can go check it out. I also talked to some CM players where they told me that Tribute is actually better than RMC because of the follow-up buffs this Pure Fiction had. However, wanted to do it with his normal team. I don't want to take chances, so I use Anaxa's signature Lycon as well, since his S1 can basically allow him to charge Ring much more. I used all the characters' normal sets, so basically I didn't have Cerridra on Vomvac. I had her on Lushaku. My focus is simply on charging recollection for Siren as fast as possible while maintaining mem buffs properly. Timing Siren with Pirish to take advantage of maximum damage. The main RNG would actually be the Bellabar guards on wave 3 that hits you and delays you, but these can still be managed properly. So long as Anaxa himself doesn't really get hard targeted, you'll pretty much live through all the damage. So in general, it's pretty unlikely that you would die from the enemy in this game mode. That was a bit long, so how am I able to consistently score 40k with Anaxa in Pure Fiction, a game mode where he historically sucks at? By the way, I only took 2 attempts on this. My first attempt, I actually got 37k because I didn't manage my recollection properly and I made some mistakes. I was just feeling it out. I actually didn't die, I just didn't manage to clear it before the cycles ended. And the second attempt, I got 40k. So that comes down to a couple of reasons. So first is stage matchup. Second, having a good understanding of my team's kit and playstyle. And third, just having proper builds. So let's first talk about matchup. I chose Japard for Anaxa to maximize his chances, as Japard is the easiest out of the three. Even though Japard has 20% wind resistance, so does King Pompon, and Pompon has a 60% damage reduction phase that is pure nightmare fuel. I know that Wave 2 of King Pompon has the action advancing stingray that could potentially damage my team. If King Pompon gets to move 3 times, or 2 times if I have bad RNG, honestly just 2 times is enough, I know it's very likely someone on my team will die. On the other hand, the deer has 40% wind resistance, so it's already more than the other two. The branches have RNG that can CC my team where I'll have no way of cleansing, and Wave 2 also has self-action advancing mobs, which, without any follow-up characters on my team, will be quite difficult to deal with. I'm also well aware that Anaxa doesn't output enough damage and Pure Fiction to bypass these phases fast enough to evade the damage. Therefore, Japard is logically the easiest choice. I also choose the speed buff to maximize the amount of turns he'll get. The buff you choose will matter a lot, as it can be the difference between you clearing or not in some cases. Next is just knowing my character's kit properly. My goal is to maximize Siren's recollection, so I'm always trying to be aware how I can do the best to charge the most. Perhaps in a future Anaxa video I'll talk more about it, but for those who didn't know, when Peerage is activated, it is considered Winds reaction, which if timed well, could translate to an extra recollection charge. In the context of Sustainless, every charge can count. I could go on and on about Anaxa's playstyle, but it's not really important here. My knowledge of the team comp allows me to pilot him more effectively than if I were just mindlessly spamming. In short, player skill can matter a lot in Sustainless team comps and determine its true effectiveness. A good player can raise a team to its true potential, while an average player might make some mistakes. I don't think I'm a pro, but I have enough knowledge to properly clear the stage with minimal effort. To demonstrate this difference, I will have to expose my friend. I was away for a while, and I let my friend, who is not a meta player, play my Pure Fiction. For some unknown reason, she decided to go Sustainless on my E2 Firefly, but only scored 34,000. If you know me well enough, you know I can always score 40k easily with Firefly. This is not her fault, as she is simply a husbando player who plays for fun and occasionally asks me to help her clear endgame. She also doesn't own Firefly, but instead plays Boot Hill. This showcases the gap between me and her on our knowledge on how to play Firefly. Another thing is build quality. My Anaxa build is currently 91 186 EV, which would be 101 186 in combat because of RMC crit rate buffs. It will be reasonable to say that if someone only has 75 crit rate and maybe 150 crit damage, or even less, they will have a significantly harder time to clear than I do, due to potentially missed crits and just less damage output overall. This generally leads to a slower clear time, which also means the enemy has more opportunities to damage you, greatly increasing the chance of you dying, which increases even more RNG. In general, the better your build is, the less RNG you'll have. This isn't always the case, of course, as seen by this crazy Korean guy who did the 2-cost Herta 0 cycle on Ligas. He purposely sandbagged his own builds to crit fish for the perfect clear. This isn't realistic at all, and I don't advise anyone to do this because I would never try to do that either. Anyways, I was getting a bit off topic. Beyond just generic build quality, there's also the set you're using. This applies more so to general gameplay as well, so it can help too in normal sustained clears. I know a lot of critique is on Ego and Von Vac, but many other sets could matter as well. For example, I know it's common knowledge for most people to recommend the Bone 2-piece for Chibi. I, however, almost never recommend this set unless you're playing her on the HP scaling team. For most support sets, I recommend the infamous Lushaka instead. That can buff your main DPS while charging Chibi or whoever it is even faster. Chibi can also hold the Converging Star set on Ashblade teams or just follow-up teams in general, which means your Astral can use the Durin set instead for even higher overall damage. In other words, the set you can use determines how fast you clear, and these small things, like these small micro adjustments, can add up in the long term. So I'm not really talking about my Anaxa clear anymore, but another thing I want to briefly touch on relative quality is the main stats. I'm sure many of you, if you build any DPS, probably searched up something along the lines of, do I use attack orb or lightning damage orb for Akron, something like that. While this doesn't matter too much to attack skillers, it could matter to other characters in Sustainless, such as Evernight or Boot Hill. If you're playing Sustainless, you have no healers, so an ice damage orb would inherently be worse than HP orb, even if it does slightly more damage. Boot Hill technically has a really awful crit attack scaling, so in theory it should make attack orb do a little bit more damage. But in practice, an HP or defense orb is just superior. Otherwise, focus on maximizing your defensive capabilities if you can. I have never bothered to try and get a fire damage bonus on for my Morton Axe Blade, because I know the HP will always be better in practically any scenario. Not to mention, damage bonus orbs are just notoriously rare. They're really hard to get, and it is simply more efficient to focus on defensive stats. It's easier to build, and I just think it's better in general. In some niche scenarios, you might also want to use HP main stats on your attack scaling DPS. In the 4.3 King, the Herta clears actually have Herta and Anaxa both use HP main stats instead of attack to counter against a 500 HP drain. Normally they will have too little HP to counter the HP drain and die. They just wouldn't have enough turns, so the extra HP is needed even at the expense of less overall damage. In my personal experience, I actually used HP Body on Fugue for that king. This does tank my effect hit rate, but the RNG isn't as bad as people think. The HP Body lets Fugue survive as many hits as Dahlia and Harmony MC, which is crucial in beating the stage. Conversely, you can also forego defensive stats for offensive stats sometimes. An example of this is my RMC and my Herta Deer Zero Cycle. My attack orb has higher crit damage than my HP orb, and I know my RMC will only take one hit in the run, which means he will never die. So I'm safe to use attack orb for the higher crit damage. So basically, if you know that your characters won't really take a lot of damage, you can sometimes use more offensive stats if they have better substats instead. Generally, defensive stats are still better, but you can just use more offensive stats if you know you won't take any damage. I would talk about speed, but for general sustainless clear, speed isn't as important as people will make it to be. Basic speed requirements are enough. Speed is usually used for zero cycle clears, and if you don't care about zero cycle, this is not something you have to worry about, as speed requirements for zero cycle tend to be quite brutal. I might make a separate video discussing how hard zero cycling actually is, because while I don't think sustainless is that hard, zero cycling is a completely different playing field. Anyways, enough of build quality. Now I want to talk about how you don't die. The goal is usually to minimize damage being dealt to your own team. Typically when I'm playing Sustainless, I'm aware of how much damage the enemy will deal to me. So to draw another example is the 3.8 King check when Sunday was the boss. Sunday practically never attacks, so I know that it's pretty much impossible for me to die, especially that I'm using my Firefly team, who can all build defensive stats, and Firefly herself can self-heal. Again, I'm going to take another of my clear, which would be my Anaxa Epoch clear. I know I keep talking about Anaxa, but I don't think my other Sustainless clears are as relatable. We all know how infamous Nicodor is. He deals far too much damage to be ignored. Anaxa is quite fragile. I know the team is guaranteed to die if Nicodor attacks 3 times. In fact, if Nicodor attacks 2 times, you already need some RNG to survive. But if Nicodor only attacks once, my entire team can always survive, which means there's no hit RNG at all. This means my goal is to somehow create a rotation that only allows Nicodor to attack me once at most. In order to do this, I use Shadow Burn on RMC. This tanks my overall damage but allows me to completely avoid damage, resulting in a higher overall score. This is sort of self-glazed, but ties back to my main point on knowing your own team comp can help you play better. For the context, if I use a Sustain, Anaxa would even score 3400, which is lower than the minimum threshold for APOC. My final score was 3704 without S1 and 3753 with S1, but that was with some optimization. If I just troll, I will still score a minimum of 3600, which is still quite high. So basically the goal is to maximize the amount of actions you can take before the enemies take their turns, so you can, well, I guess prevent them from taking turns. In short, knowing how much damage your team will receive and knowing how to delay the enemies can help plan better on how to tackle the stage properly. Of course, Sustainless isn't always sunshine and rainbows. Past a certain damage limit, it can be impossible for your team to clear unless you have higher investments. A very easy example is using Herta against Graphia. Graphia is just a single target mob that sometimes spawns the clowns, but in general it doesn't take a genius to realize that the Herta sucks against Graphia. Therefore, it's quite obvious that easier Herta won't be able to go Sustainless, no matter what you would need E2 for that. Since we're on the topic of not dying, I want to talk about Morton Axe Blade again. On my last video, I talked about Mayday taunting, making him an excellent Sustainless option. Morton Axe Blade can be excellent in helping your team survive, so if you didn't know, team positioning actually matters. There was another video that talked about how team positioning can matter on follow-up attacks, but it's not really what I want to talk about here. Typically, you want to put Morton Axe Blade at the edge of the team. This means if there's any blast attack for the enemy, it will only hit him and the character adjacent to him, who is typically a buffer who can run defensive stats. This way your main DPS can completely avoid taking damage, since more Anaxa Blade just tanks all of it. There's another way to avoid getting hit, and that is Welt, who can quote-unquote pseudo-sustain. Both his ult and skill can delay and slow the enemies to prevent them from hitting you. He is also quite strong on Himiko Nova teams, which can help her achieve faster clears and Army of Chaos and Anomaly, but I don't really want to talk too much about Welt since it's pretty straightforward. I know most people already covered this topic before, but I want to briefly talk about Break and Finon again. Both Firefly and HNC actually have, built-in delay, which is why enemies take so long to recover their Break bar. Rama herself also has a delay. This is generally what makes Break better than other teams in Sustainless, a tanky team that can delay the enemies. As for Finon, we already know his zone isolates him, so he can also heal from attacking. He doesn't die, and he just dispels his zonenesses, which means he can indefinitely re-enter as long as he charges fast enough. Yunli is actually somewhat similar to this regard. Just like Finon, she can also heal. Sadly, her multipliers are weak, and she's a counter DPS, which kind of makes her a bad archetype in general. So yeah, Yunli is kind of Teemu Finon, if you will say. As I mentioned in my other videos, you want to maximize your own character's kit and utilize them to their full potential. My main points again. So first is you want to make sure the stage is possible, right? If I know the stage is impossible to do for Sustainless, I'm not going to try to do that. That's kind of dumb. Just want to take the time to say that I actually do most of my initial in-game clear with the sustain. I don't just do Sustainless immediately. I usually want to get a feel for the stage before attempting Sustainless. Part of this is also choosing a favorable matchup. So, like I said, you want to make sure the stage is appropriate, and your characters could probably, beat it. Just making sure you won't take that much damage, or you might die. Second, make sure you have the proper builds that can help you best in beating the stage. Choosing the right sets and main stats could matter a lot. Build quality matters a lot, as well as damage control and damage thresholds are crucial in controlling the flow of the gameplay. Damage control is more so a zero cycling thing, but it could help too in Sustainless clears. Third is skill. Skill and knowledge of your own team can help a lot in optimizing gameplay. I'm always learning new things about my own teams on how to play them better. But, the more you know, the better you are at utilizing and, maximizing your own team. This, you can always ask for help or look at other showcases to help yourself. Because, sometimes it's not always so intuitive. I sometimes ask for help too. There's no shame in that. Of course, advice isn't always useful. I sometimes get advice like, this is impossible, or why the hell are you doing this? For example, in my pursuit to zero cycling King Pom-Pom, I was told many times it wasn't really possible. Even then, there are still a lot of smart people in the community that can give good advice. Conclude, I find Sustainless to be a fun alternative way to play the game. I just wanted to give my experience on that style of the gameplay and how I go about it. I hope you can find something to take away from this video to improve your own Star Rail gameplay experiences. Anyways, I just wanted to give my 2 cents on Sustainless. I do think I articulated my points better in this video, so I hope you do enjoy it more. As always, if you liked it, be sure to like and subscribe as I talk more about my bad opinions on this game.